There is an emotional wound that silently destroys millions of people, a pain that doesn't show on the face. It leaves no visible scars, but it slowly corrodes the soul every single day. The pain of not being valued by someone you would never stop valuing. Maybe you know exactly what that feels like. You give attention, you give time, you give affection, you give loyalty, and in return, you receive silence, coldness, indifference, emotional absence. At first you try to understand, then you try to fix it, then you try to deserve it, until without realizing it you begin to believe the problem is you. And that is the most dangerous point of all. Because when a person spends too much time being emotionally ignored, they begin to forget their own worth. Carl Jung once said that what we repeatedly accept eventually shapes our identity. And many people live in empty relationships for years because deep down, they learn to survive emotionally through rejection. They confuse suffering with love, neediness with connection, emotional dependence with intensity. And while they desperately try to be chosen by someone, they completely abandon themselves. Maybe that is exactly what is happening to you right now. Maybe there is a part of you that is tired of begging for presents, tired of chasing after people, tired of feeling like you are never enough. And there is something you need to understand today. The moment you walk away from someone who never valued your presence is not a loss. It is an awakening. Because some people only enter your life to reveal how far you had drifted from yourself. And when you finally stop begging for love, attention, and recognition, something powerful begins to happen. Your mind changes, your energy changes, your silence changes, your entire life begins to change. In this video, you will understand why certain relationships drain your soul, why so many people remain where they are not valued, and what truly happens when you emotionally walk away from someone who never saw your real worth. And maybe, by the end of this journey, you will realize that losing certain people did not destroy your life. It was exactly what started saving it. There is a kind of pain that almost no one can explain. It leaves no marks on the body. It makes no noise. It does not appear in photographs, but it slowly destroys a person from within. It is the pain of realizing that you were always present for someone who was never truly present for you. You listened. You understood. You forgave. You insisted. You stayed. Even when you were already exhausted. Even when some part of you was begging to leave. And the most dangerous part of all this is that constant rejection does not only hurt the heart. It begins to alter the way you see yourself. The lack of appreciation enters the mind like silent poison. First, you begin to doubt your importance, then your intelligence, your beauty, your ability, your worth, until one day you accept emotional crumbs as if they were love. And maybe that is exactly what is happening to you now. Maybe you are trying to convince someone to recognize something that should never need to be explained. Your value. In his studies of the human psyche, Carl Jung said that what we deny within ourselves eventually controls our lives in silence. And many people spend years accepting empty relationships because deep down, they learned to believe they must earn love through suffering. So they erase themselves, they make themselves smaller, they adapt, they silence themselves, all to avoid being abandoned. But there comes a moment when the soul begins to rebel against this, a moment when you look at everything you gave and realize you never even received the minimum. And that realization changes everything, because from that point on, staying begins to hurt more than leaving. Maybe you still haven't fully realized it. Maybe there is still a part of you trying to save the relationship, the friendship, the connection, the presence of that person. But there is a question that needs to be asked now. How many times will you have to destroy yourself just to continue being accepted by someone? Emotionally cold people possess a silent ability. They make you believe you are asking for too much, when in reality, you are only asking for reciprocity. And little by little, you stop being who you once were. Your energy changes. Your light fades away. Your silence grows. Your mind becomes tired. Your heart lives in a constant state of waiting for a message, a validation, a recognition, a minimal sign of consideration, and this imprisons the soul. The worst emotional prison is not the one where someone locks you in. It is the one where you continue to stay even knowing you deserve more. There is a difference between loving someone and abandoning yourself just to keep someone in your life. Many people never realize that difference, and they spend years living in relationships where they are merely tolerated, emotionally used, or only sought out for convenience. But something begins to happen when you awaken. You stop chasing. You stop begging. You stop explaining yourself. You stop trying to convince someone of your worth. And when that happens, a silent transformation begins within you. At first, it feels frightening, because the emptiness appears, the loneliness appears, the silence appears. But there is something that almost no one understands. The silence that comes after walking away is not the end of your life. It is the beginning of reconnecting with who you were before you accepted so little. And in the next chapter, you will understand how people who constantly give themselves away end up falling into an invisible emotional exhaustion, slowly losing their own identity without realizing it. There is a type of person who almost always ends up emotionally drained, not because they are weak, but because they feel too deeply. These are people who enter environments trying to bring peace, who listen more than they speak, who notice details no one else notices, who carry other people's problems as if they were their own. And almost always, these people believe that loving means enduring everything in silence. So they begin to tolerate absence, coldness, indifference, lack of consideration. Because deep down, there is a secret hope. The hope that if they continue being good enough, they will finally be valued. But that rarely happens. People who are used to receiving everything effortlessly rarely realize how much they are destroying the ones who constantly give everything of themselves. And that is where the invisible exhaustion begins. It does not happen all at once. It happens little by little. First, you begin justifying behaviors. Then you begin ignoring signs. Then you start normalizing what once hurt you, until your mind enters a dangerous state of emotional adaptation. You no longer expect affection. You no longer expect reciprocity. You no longer expect priority. You begin to feel grateful for the bare minimum. Carl Jung observed that what we repress emotionally does not disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious until it begins to affect our energy, our thoughts, and even our identity. And that is exactly what happens when someone spends their life trying to be accepted by people who never recognize their true worth. The person begins to lose connection with themselves. They smile while exhausted. They help while hurting. They remain while feeling empty. And the saddest part is that almost no one notices. Because emotionally exhausted people learn to hide their pain very well. They keep functioning. They keep showing up. They keep saying everything is fine, while inside they are silently falling apart. Maybe you know this feeling. The feeling of being surrounded by people, and still feeling an emptiness that is difficult to explain. That happens because the soul realizes when it is being used only as emotional support. When your presence is convenient, but your heart was never a priority. And there is something even deeper about this. The more you try to prove your worth to someone who does not recognize your importance, the more you begin to drift away from your own essence. You change the way you act. You change the way you speak. You change your boundaries. You change your personality. Everything to avoid rejection. But there is an extremely high price for that. The gradual loss of identity. Many people no longer know who they truly are because they spent too much time trying to become what others would accept. And the more this happens, the greater the inner emptiness becomes, because the soul cannot endure living too long disconnected from its own truth. That is why some people begin to feel an inexplicable exhaustion. It is not only physical fatigue, it is accumulated emotional exhaustion. It is the mind tired of insisting, the heart tired of waiting, the soul tired of begging for recognition. And the most dangerous part is that this exhaustion creates emotional dependency. The person begins to believe they must keep trying, as if giving up meant failure, as if walking away meant losing something important. But most of the time, they already lost it long ago. They lost peace. They lost energy. They lost self-esteem. They lost parts of themselves. And there is a deep psychological reason for this. Because many times you are not attached to the person. You are attached to the need to finally feel chosen. And this is exactly where the most silent trap of the human mind begins. In the next chapter, you will understand why so many people remain where they are not valued, and how unconscious emotional wounds make someone confuse suffering with love. There is a question that few people have the courage to ask themselves. If this relationship hurts so much, why do you stay? The answer is almost never in the other person. It is in the emotional wounds you carry without realizing it. Because no one remains in places where they are constantly diminished without there being a deep psychological reason behind it. And this is where everything starts becoming more serious. Many people believe they are fighting for love. But what truly exists is a desperate attempt to fill old emotional voids. Carl Jung explained that unresolved emotional experiences remain alive in the unconscious mind and silently begin to influence our choices. So without realizing it, a person starts repeating emotional patterns they have known since very early in life. They become attached to rejection because they learned that love and suffering walk together. Maybe no one has ever told you this before, but many times, you did not choose emotionally cold people by accident. You chose what felt familiar, the lack of attention, the emotional distance, the difficulty of receiving affection, the feeling of needing to earn someone's love. All of this may have started long before the person who hurt you entered your life. And when the mind associates suffering with emotional validation, an invisible prison is born. You begin to believe that you must fight to deserve affection, that you must insist in order to matter, that you must endure pain in order not to be abandoned, and then something dangerous happens. You stop seeing the signs clearly. You ignore disrespect. You accept repeated excuses. You normalize indifference. You confuse emotional crumbs with depth. Because your emotional emptiness begins to distort reality. The person shows the bare minimum, and it feels enormous to someone who has spent their entire life lacking genuine affection. That is why some people form such intense bonds with those who hurt them. It is not healthy love. It is emotional attachment fueled by the need for approval. And there is an even more painful detail in all of this. The more a person feels they are losing someone emotionally unavailable, the more they insist. Because the unconscious mind interprets rejection as a challenge. And the ego believes that finally being chosen will heal all old wounds. But it will not. No person can fill a void that was born within you. This is one of the greatest emotional illusions in life. You spend years trying to receive from someone else what only your own awareness can rebuild. And while this happens, your energy is slowly consumed. You overthink constantly. You analyze messages. You replay conversations in your mind. You create expectations. You imagine changes that never come. Your mind enters a constant state of emotional anxiety, because confusing relationships create psychological dependency. One day the person shows affection. The next day, they disappear. Then they return. Then they become cold again. And this emotional instability becomes addictive. The brain starts living in expectation of small doses of attention, like someone lost in the desert waiting for drops of water. It is cruel, but extremely common. And maybe now you are beginning to understand something important. Maybe you never stayed because of love. Maybe you stayed because you were afraid to face the emptiness that would exist without that person. Many people prefer to continue suffering in exhausting relationships rather than face the loneliness of reconnecting with themselves. Because silence is frightening. When emotional distraction disappears, you finally begin to hear everything you tried to ignore for years. Your insecurities, your fears, your low self-esteem, your need for validation. And it is exactly at this moment that the true awakening begins, because there comes a time when the soul becomes tired of negotiating its own dignity just to continue being accepted. In the next chapter, you will notice the silent signs that your soul begins to emotionally detach even before you make the decision to leave. There comes a moment when something changes inside you. It does not happen explosively. There is no announcement. There is no final argument. There is only a different kind of silence emerging within the soul. And almost no one notices it immediately, because for a long time you believed you still had the strength to keep trying. You still had hope. You still had patience. You still had enough love to endure everything. But there comes a point when even the most persistent heart begins to grow tired. First you feel a strange heaviness. Then you lose enthusiasm. Then you realize you no longer feel the need to explain what you feel. What once created desperation begins to create silence. And that silence means far more than it seems. Carl Jung said that the soul always seeks balance. When a relationship demands that you destroy your own essence in order to remain in it, the unconscious mind slowly begins creating emotional distance as a survival mechanism. That is why some people begin to detach internally long before they physically leave. The soul perceives what the mind still tries to deny. You begin noticing small changes. The anxiety decreases. The need to please weakens. The urge to chase after someone slowly disappears. And that is frightening, because for a long time that relationship occupied too much space within you. Your emotional routine revolved around that person. Your mood depended on their attention. Your peace depended on their reactions. But now something begins to break. You realize how emotionally trapped you were, and maybe for the first time, you begin to see the relationship without the illusion created by emotional emptiness. This is an extremely painful moment, because truth rarely arrives in a comfortable way. You begin to realize that you were trying to save connections that never made any effort to save you. You begin to realize how many times you silenced your pain just to avoid conflict. How many times you swallowed sadness so you would not lose someone. How many times you accepted less than you deserved simply to avoid feeling alone. And then a question arises that becomes impossible to ignore. Who did you become while trying to be loved by this person? That question changes everything. Because at that moment, you stop looking only at the other person's behavior and begin looking at the abandonment you practiced against yourself. This is the most difficult awakening, realizing that the greatest wound may not have been caused by the person who failed to value you. Maybe it was caused by all the times you realized it and still chose to stay. There is a deep sadness in betraying your own soul just to avoid losing someone. And the soul demands payment for that. It demands it through emotional exhaustion, through anxiety, through insomnia, through the constant feeling of emptiness, through the loss of energy, through the disconnection from yourself. The body remains present, but inside, you no longer feel alive. And maybe it is exactly at this point that many people confuse love with unavoidable suffering. But true love does not destroy your identity. It does not extinguish your light. It does not make you live in constant fear of not being enough. When healthy love exists, peace exists, even through difficulties. When emotional attachment exists, tension exists. Insecurity exists. A constant need for approval exists. And your soul begins to notice this difference before your conscious mind fully accepts it. That is why emotional detachment begins silently. You no longer feel the desire to keep insisting. You no longer want to argue. You no longer want to convince anyone of your worth. What once seemed impossible slowly begins to lose its power. And there is something deeply symbolic about that. Before leaving someone's life, your soul tries to return to you. It tries to recover everything that was lost while you were fighting to be chosen. But many people interrupt this process. When they begin to feel the emotional detachment inside themselves, they run back to the person again. They beg for attention. They force reconnections. They try to revive something that emotionally died a long time ago. Because fear still exists. The fear of loneliness, the fear of emptiness, the fear of never being loved again. But there is a liberating truth that almost no one understands. Loneliness never hurts as much as staying where your soul is becoming sick. And when you finally understand that, something powerful begins to happen. You stop chasing people who were never afraid of losing you. In the next chapter, you will discover the frightening power of distance and why the silence of someone who has emotionally awakened completely changes the dynamics of relationships. There comes a moment when silence begins to say everything your words could never explain. And that moment completely changes the dynamics of the relationship. Because while you were chasing insisting, explaining, forgiving, and remaining emotionally available all the time, the other person never had to face the real possibility of losing you. Your presence seemed guaranteed. And when someone believes they will always have you, they begin treating your love as something ordinary. This is one of the most painful mistakes emotionally intense people make. They give so much of themselves that they eventually become predictable. And what is predictable is rarely valued by emotionally selfish people. But everything changes when you stop. When you become silent. When you stop looking for them. When you stop insisting. When your energy stops chasing someone who never moved in your direction. Because distance reveals truths that closeness was hiding. People who never valued your presence begin to notice the emptiness you used to silently fill. They miss the attention, the availability, the care, the emotional safety you offered. And many times they only realize your value when they no longer have access to your energy. This does not happen because you manipulated anyone. It happens because your absence forces people to see what they ignored, while you were always present. Carl Jung spoke about how absence can reveal unconscious contents hidden within human relationships. When someone loses constant access to an emotionally important presence, deep parts of the mind begin to react, and that is exactly why distance feels so frightening. Because it breaks emotional patterns. For a long time, you fed a dynamic where only one person made an effort, where only one person emotionally sustained the connection. When you interrupt that, the entire structure begins to collapse. But there is something even more important happening. While the other person notices your absence, you begin to notice your own presence. And that changes everything. Your mind starts becoming quieter. Your anxiety decreases. You stop living while waiting for messages. You stop imagining responses. You stop analyzing the smallest signs. Your energy slowly begins returning to you. At first, it feels strange, because people who are used to living in emotional dependency confuse peace with emptiness. They no longer remember what it feels like to live without constant psychological tension. So silence feels frightening. Calmness feels like loneliness. Stability feels like emotional distance. The absence of suffering feels like a lack of love. But it is not. You are simply so accustomed to emotional chaos that you forgot what peace feels like. And maybe this is one of the greatest liberations in life. Discovering that it was not love keeping you trapped. It was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of not being enough. Fear of never finding someone better. Fear of being forgotten. But there is a powerful irony in all of this. The more afraid you were of losing someone, the more you lost yourself. And distance begins rebuilding exactly what was destroyed inside you. Your self-esteem slowly returns. Your thoughts become clearer. Your dignity reappears. Your identity begins breathing again. You start noticing simple things again. You begin feeling lightness again. You begin existing again without emotionally depending on someone else's validation. And this bothers people who were used to controlling your emotional emptiness. Because when you emotionally awaken, you stop being manipulable. You no longer accept crumbs. You no longer chase attention. You no longer negotiate your peace just to maintain empty connections. Your silence begins to carry strength. And there is something almost frightening about that. People who never listen to your words begin to deeply feel your absence, because distance possesses a power that arguments never had. It reveals who truly cared, and who merely became accustomed to your availability. But the most important thing is not what others begin to feel. It is what begins to awaken inside you. Because when your energy stops being wasted trying to convince someone of your worth, it finally begins rebuilding your own life. And in the next chapter, you will understand why the moment you choose yourself completely changes your mind, your energy, and the way the world begins to see you. There is a silent transformation that happens when you finally stop abandoning yourself just to keep someone in your life. It does not begin on the outside. It begins within. First comes the silence. Then comes clarity. You begin realizing how emotionally exhausted you had been living, how much your mind was trapped in cycles of anxiety, expectation, and frustration. And then something changes. You wake up without that desperate need, to check messages, without needing to interpret signs, without living emotionally dependent on someone else's actions. For the first time in a long time, your energy begins to belong to you. It sounds simple, but it is not. Because people who spent years searching for emotional validation forget what it feels like to exist without constantly needing to prove their worth. They live trying to be enough for others, trying to please, trying not to disappoint, trying to be chosen, until they realize something liberating. Those who truly recognize your value do not require you to destroy yourself in order to be loved. Carl Jung believed that the process of individuation happens when a person begins reconnecting with their true essence, no longer living only to satisfy external expectations. And few things bring someone closer to their own essence, more than the moment they decide to stop accepting relationships that diminish their soul. Because when you choose yourself, your vision changes. You begin seeing what you once ignored. You notice emotional manipulation that you used to call love. You notice absence disguised as independence. You notice coldness hidden behind excuses. But most importantly, you begin to recognize your own value, and that changes the way you face life. You no longer accept just anyone's presence. You are no longer impressed by emotional crumbs. You no longer feel obligated to remain in places where your peace disappears. Your mind matures. There is a huge difference between being alone and feeling abandoned. Emotionally awakened people learn this. They discover that solitude is not punishment. It is reconstruction. It is in silence that you begin hearing your own voice again. It is in distance that you begin seeing clearly again. It is in the absence of chaos that your soul finally begins to rest. And maybe you never realized this before. But many times the problem was never loneliness. The problem was being surrounded by people who made you feel invisible. That realization completely transforms the way you relate to others. You stop begging for connection. You begin observing reciprocity. You stop chasing approval. You begin protecting your energy. And the more you do this, the less your self-esteem depends on the actions of others. There is enormous strength in someone who finally understands their own worth. That person no longer needs to convince anyone of anything. They do not chase people. They do not force presence. They do not beg for attention. They simply walk away from what destroys their peace. And that kind of silence carries power, because emotionally healed people learn something that changes everything. Not every loss is truly a loss. Sometimes losing someone who never valued you is exactly what saves your mind, your energy, and your identity. But there is an important detail. When you begin choosing yourself, some people will say that you have changed, that you became cold, distant, different. But almost always, that means only one thing. You stopped accepting what you once tolerated out of emotional emptiness. And that bothers those who benefited from your lack of boundaries, because people who are used to your availability feel uncomfortable when they realize you no longer accept emotional crumbs. Your silence begins to command respect. Your absence gains weight. Your peace begins to matter more than empty connections. And maybe this is one of the greatest emotional evolutions in life. Understanding that self-love is not selfishness. It is emotional survival. In the next chapter, you will discover what most people never understood about detachment and why walking away from those who do not value you is not coldness, but one of the greatest signs of emotional maturity. There is a completely distorted idea about detachment. Many people believe that walking away means no longer loving, that creating boundaries means becoming cold, that choosing your own peace is selfishness. But that is far from the truth. True detachment is not born from anger. It is born from awareness. You do not walk away because you hate someone. You walk away because you finally realized how much of yourself you were losing while trying to stay. And that realization completely changes the way you see relationships. Because when awareness awakens, you understand something profound. Love without reciprocity cannot sustain anyone. Constant sacrifice does not build a healthy connection. Trying alone will never save a relationship. Carl Jung spoke about how human beings spend much of their lives trying to be accepted, often hiding their true essence in order to avoid rejection. And that is exactly what happens in emotionally exhausting relationships. You begin abandoning important parts of yourself simply to continue being accepted by someone. You silence your opinions. You tolerate pain. You ignore your intuition. You diminish your feelings, all to maintain a presence that deep down never made a real effort to remain in your life. But there comes a moment when your soul simply can no longer endure this kind of emotional prison. And that is where detachment begins, not as an escape, but as liberation. You stop insisting where there is no reciprocity. You stop chasing those who were never afraid of losing you. You stop trying to convince someone of your worth. And something extremely powerful happens within you. Your energy changes. Because while you were emotionally trapped, all your strength was being used to maintain fragile connections. Your mind lived exhausted. Your heart lived on alert. Your peace depended on another person's actions. But detachment breaks that invisible chain. And when that chain breaks, you begin breathing emotionally again. At first, it hurts. It hurts because you miss the expectation, the emotional routine, the illusion that one day everything could change. Many times you do not miss the person. You miss the hope you created around them. And understanding that is one of the hardest parts of emotional maturity, because it forces you to face reality without fantasy. It forces you to accept that some people never intended to love you in the way you needed. They simply liked the way you made them feel. And there is a huge difference between being loved and being convenient. When someone truly loves you, there is care. There is presence. There is reciprocity. There is mutual effort. When someone merely becomes accustomed to you, there is comfort. The person appears when they want to, disappears when they want to, gives little, receives a lot, and even so, you remain there, hoping that one day they will recognize your value. But there is something few people have the courage to admit. Someone who did not value you while they had access to your presence was probably too comfortable to recognize your importance. That is why detachment feels so frightening. Because when you walk away, the dynamic changes, the control changes, the access changes, and for the first time, the other person has to face the real possibility of your absence. But the greatest benefit of detachment is not teaching someone to miss you. It is teaching you never again to abandon your own dignity just to be accepted. That is the true awakening. You realize that peace is worth more than empty presence, that silence is worth more than inconsistent attention, that solitude is worth more than relationships that drain your soul. And the more you understand this, the less need you feel to beg for space in someone else's life. Because emotionally mature people do not chase those who constantly show they do not know how to value them. They simply move forward, without hatred, without revenge, without the need to prove anything. And there is immense strength in that. The strength of someone who finally realized that losing people who never recognized their worth is not defeat. It is liberation. In the next chapter, you will understand how all this pain can transform into profound reconstruction and why, after this awakening, you will never be the same person again. There comes a moment when pain stops being only suffering. It transforms into awareness. And when that happens, something inside you awakens permanently. You begin looking at your former self with a sense of disbelief. The version of you that begged for attention, that accepted emotional crumbs, that stayed silent to avoid losing people, that made itself smaller to fit into someone else's life. And for the first time, you realize how far you had drifted from yourself. That realization hurts, but it also liberates, because awareness has an irreversible effect. Once you see the truth, you can never return to living in the same illusion. Carl Jung said that no one reaches consciousness without confronting their own darkness. And perhaps that was exactly your greatest transformation. Pain forced you to see everything you had been trying to avoid. Your emotional emptiness, your fear of abandonment, your need for validation, your difficulty choosing yourself. But now there is a difference. You no longer run away from these things. You begin understanding your wounds instead of blaming yourself for them. You begin respecting your boundaries. You begin protecting your peace. You begin realizing that true love should never require you to destroy your own essence. And this understanding completely changes your energy. Because conscious people stop living while begging for recognition. They do not need to convince anyone of their worth. They do not need to compete for attention. They do not need to sacrifice themselves to maintain superficial connections. There is calmness within them, a silent calmness, a steady presence, a dignity that comes from within. And maybe this is the most powerful transformation of all. Before, you believed you needed to be chosen in order to feel important. Now, you understand that your value never depended on other people's ability to see it. That transforms the way you love. You begin loving without abandoning yourself, without losing your identity, without negotiating your emotional peace. And when someone does not recognize your value, you no longer insist the way you once did, because you finally understood something essential. Those who truly want your presence do not make you fight alone to remain in their lives. That truth closes entire cycles within the mind. The anxiety decreases. The desperation disappears. The constant need for approval begins to die. And in its place, something much stronger is born. Inner presence. You learn to enjoy your own company. You learn to respect your silence. You learn not to fill emotional voids with relationships that only increase your pain. That does not mean you will never feel sadness again. It simply means you will never again accept just anything to avoid loneliness. And that transformation frightens many people. Because people who were accustomed to the old version of you realize they can no longer control you through absence, coldness, or indifference. You changed. Not because you became cold, but because you finally learned to love yourself without begging for love from others. And there is something extremely powerful about someone who reaches this level of awareness. That person stops chasing those who do not value their presence, stops investing energy in one-sided relationships, stops confusing emotional intensity with true connection. They understand that some people enter your life only to reveal what still needed healing within you. Maybe the person who hurt you never came to stay. Maybe they came to awaken you, to awaken your awareness, your boundaries, your self-love, your courage to leave. Because some losses do not come to destroy your life. They come to rebuild you. And once that reconstruction begins, nothing remains the same. Your perspective changes. Your energy changes. Your silence changes. Your presence changes. You never again accept being loved halfway. In the next chapter, you will enter the deepest conclusion of this journey and understand why losing someone who never valued you may have been the greatest liberation of your life. Perhaps one of the greatest pains in life is realizing that you spent too much time trying to be important to people who never had the emotional capacity to recognize your worth. You insisted. You waited. You forgave. You understood. While little by little you abandoned yourself. And for a long time you believed that love meant staying. Even when the relationship hurt you. Even when your soul was already exhausted. Even when your heart lived in a constant state of emotional emptiness. But there is a truth that completely transforms the way you see all of this. Not every loss represents failure. Some losses represent liberation. Carl Jung said that the most important encounter in life happens when a human being finds themselves. And few things force someone to reconnect with themselves as deeply as walking away from people who never knew how to value them. Because when you stop chasing those who ignored your presence, something extraordinary happens. Your energy returns. Your mind slows down. Your dignity reappears. You begin breathing again without constant anxiety. You begin sleeping again without carrying the emotional weight of rejection. You begin existing again without emotionally depending on someone else's validation. And maybe for the first time in a very long time, you begin to feel peace. Not the peace of someone who was finally chosen, but the peace of someone who finally chose themselves. That is the true transformation. Understanding that your worth was never in the hands of those who failed to recognize your importance. Your worth was always within you. It was only hidden behind the fear of losing people who were never afraid of losing you. And when that awareness awakens, life changes. You begin choosing more carefully who enters your world. You begin respecting your intuition. You begin quickly recognizing unbalanced relationships. You begin protecting your emotional peace as something sacred. Because now you understand the price of staying too long where your soul is not welcomed. There is maturity in knowing how to leave. There is strength in creating boundaries. There is self-love in refusing to accept just any presence merely to avoid loneliness. And maybe today you are living exactly this moment. The moment when your awareness has already realized what your heart is still trying to accept. Maybe it still hurts. Maybe there is still longing. Maybe there are still unanswered questions. But some answers never arrive through words. They arrive through distance, because time reveals what emotional emptiness was hiding. It reveals who truly cared, who merely became accustomed to you, who valued your essence, and who valued only your availability. And when you deeply understand this, you stop begging for space in other people's lives. You understand that true love does not need to be forced. It does not need to be chased. It does not need to destroy your self-esteem in order to exist. Healthy love brings peace, not constant confusion. It brings presence, not emotional absence. It brings reciprocity, not one-sided effort. And if someone needed to lose you in order to recognize your value, that says far more about that person's emotional limitations than about your importance. Never dim your light because someone was incapable of seeing it. Some people do not value the sun because they spent their entire lives accustomed to darkness. And perhaps losing someone who never valued you was exactly what saved your mind, your peace, and your identity. Because there are goodbyes that do not end your life. They begin your rebirth. And now I want you to reflect honestly. At what moment in your life did you realize you were abandoning yourself just to continue being accepted by someone?